Elena Marsh woke before dawn, as she did every day, and lit a small fire to warm the kitchen before her daughter opened her eyes. The house was little more than 2 rooms at the edge of Ashbourne, with a roof that leaked when the rain came hard, and a floor that creaked under every step. For 11 years, Elena had cleaned the homes of wealthier families in town, scrubbing floors and washing linens from morning until evening, just to keep food on the table and shoes on her daughter's feet. Her daughter, Mira, was 8 years old, with wide brown eyes, and a habit of asking questions that Elena could not always answer. That morning, Mira ran into the kitchen already dressed, her hair half braided and her face bright with excitement. "Mama, is it true? Is there really going to be a feast at the Duke's house?" Elena smiled and finished tying the braid herself. "That's what everyone is saying. The whole town is talking about it. Can we go, please, Mama?" Elena hesitated. She had heard the announcement 2 days earlier, read aloud in the town square by one of the Duke's men. The young Duke of Ravenscroft, who had inherited his title only 2 years before after his father's passing, had declared a grand feast to celebrate the harvest. The words had been simple but clear. All residents of Ashbourne, high and low, were invited to attend. Elena had laughed quietly to herself when she first heard it. Words like that were often said but rarely meant. She had grown used to invitations that were not truly meant for people like her. Still, Mira's eyes were pleading, and it had been a long time since her daughter had anything to look forward to. "We can go," Elena said finally, "but do not expect too much, my love. We may only get to see the gates from outside." Mira threw her arms around her mother's waist. "That's enough for me. I just want to see it." That evening, Elena borrowed a dress from her neighbor, Mrs. Whitfield, an older woman who had known Elena's mother before she passed. The dress was a soft shade of blue, a little too big in the shoulders, but clean and gentle against the skin. Elena looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror above the wash basin and barely recognized the woman staring back. It had been years since she had worn anything but her work clothes. The walk to Ravenscroft Manor took nearly an hour. Mira held her mother's hand the entire way, chattering about what the Duke might look like, whether there would be music, whether she might see a real castle up close for the first time. Elena listened and nodded, but her stomach tightened more with every step. She was not afraid of the Duke or his guards. She was afraid of the quiet shame that came from standing somewhere you were not truly wanted, no matter what the announcement had said. When they arrived, the manor gates stood open, and torches lined the long path leading up to the grand hall. Guests in fine clothing moved past them, laughing, greeting one another with familiar warmth. Elena kept her head down slightly, holding Mira's hand a little tighter, and stepped through the gates when no one stopped her. Inside the hall, the sight took her breath away despite herself. Long tables stretched from one end of the room to the other, covered in white cloth and lined with silver plates that caught the candlelight. Musicians played softly near the far wall, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Elena had never seen anything like it in her life. But as she looked closer, her heart sank. Every seat at every table was already filled. Merchants sat beside landowners, their children in fine little coats and dresses, laughing together, as if they had known one another for years. There was no place left for a woman in a borrowed dress, and her daughter in a mended coat. "Mama, where do we sit?" Mira asked, looking up at her with the same wide eyes she had worn that morning, though now they carried a flicker of uncertainty. Elena forced a smile. "We will stand near the back for a little while, sweetheart. Sometimes the best seat is the one where you can see everything." They found a quiet spot near the wall, close enough to see the tables but far enough not to be in anyone's way. Servers moved past them carrying trays of food that neither of them would taste, and Elena watched her daughter's eyes follow every dish, though the girl said nothing. She had learned, even at 8 years old, not to ask for what clearly was not meant for her. Elena told herself this was still more than she had expected. They were inside the gates. They could hear the music, smell the food, watch the candlelight flicker against the high stone walls. That, she reminded herself, was already a gift. At the head of the longest table sat the Duke himself. He was younger than most expected a Duke to be, no older than 30, with a calm face and quiet eyes that seemed to take in far more than he spoke aloud. Since inheriting his title, He had earned a reputation among the townsfolk, not for grand speeches or lavish displays, but for a habit of listening more than he talked, and watching more than he was watched. That evening, as course after course was served, and laughter rose from every table, the Duke's gaze drifted, as it often did, across the room, rather than staying fixed on his own plate. It was during one of these quiet glances that he noticed her. A woman stood near the back wall, a young girl beside her, both of them dressed simply but neatly, watching the feast unfold without a plate or a chair of their own. He noticed how the woman kept her chin lifted, despite the tiredness in her eyes, and how her daughter watched the food pass by, with a longing she was clearly trying to hide, out of respect for her mother's dignity. He looked around the hall. Dozens of chairs sat filled with guests, who had arrived long after this woman likely had. Some laughed loudly, already several courses into the meal, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that anyone might be left standing at all. The Duke set down his fork. He did not call for his steward. He did not send a servant to fetch an extra chair from storage, though that would have been the simpler and perhaps more expected solution. Instead, he rose from his own seat at the head of the table, the one carved from dark oak and cushioned in deep red velvet, the seat that marked him as master of the house and host of the evening. Conversation near him slowed as heads began to turn. It was not every day that a duke left his own seat in the middle of a feast. He walked the length of the hall, past tables of guests who fell quiet as he passed, until he reached the back wall where Elena and Mira stood. He stopped in front of them and offered a small, respectful bow of his head, as though greeting an old friend rather than a stranger. "Good evening," he said. "I don't believe we've met. I am Alden." Elena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She managed a small, uncertain curtsy. "Elena Marsh, my lord. This is my daughter, Mira. It's a pleasure to meet you both." His eyes moved briefly to Mira, who stared up at him with wide, unblinking eyes, too surprised to speak. Then his gaze returned to Elena. "Forgive me, but I could not help noticing you've been standing here for some time. That should not be the case tonight, of all nights." "We're only glad to have been invited at all, my lord," Elena said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "We don't wish to trouble anyone." "You are no trouble," he said gently. "In fact, you've reminded me of something I should not have forgotten. This feast was meant for everyone in Ashbourne. It seems in the excitement of the evening, that promise was not entirely kept." Before Elena could respond, he extended his arm toward her, the way one might offer to lead a guest of honor, rather than a stranger found standing by the wall. "Would you do me the honor of joining me at the table?" Elena stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "My lord, I couldn't possibly." "I insist," he said, his voice warm but firm, the kind of firmness that left no room for argument, yet somehow did not feel like a command. "Please." With Mira's small hand still held tightly in her own, Elena allowed herself to be led through the hall. Every eye in the room seemed to follow them, as the Duke escorted a cleaning woman in a borrowed dress and her daughter in a mended coat to the head of the table, the most honored place in the entire hall. When they reached his chair, he pulled it out himself, waving off the nearest servant who moved to assist. "Please, sit," he said to Elena, "and a second chair for the young lady, if you would," he added to another servant, who hurried to bring one for Mira. Elena sat, stunned into silence, as Mira climbed into the chair beside her, eyes wide with wonder at finding herself suddenly at the very center of the grand hall she had only moments ago been watching from a distance. The Duke did not immediately seek another seat for himself. He remained standing beside the table, speaking easily with the guests nearest him, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. When a servant approached with a new chair for him, he waved it off with a small smile, saying he preferred to stretch his legs a while longer after sitting so long already. Whispers began to move through the hall, table to table, guest to guest. Some exchanged uncertain glances, unused to seeing a nobleman set aside his own place so plainly and without hesitation. Others watched with something softer in their expressions, quietly moved by what they had just witnessed. Elena barely tasted the food that was placed in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as she cut a small piece of bread, more out of habit than hunger. She kept glancing at Mira, who was laughing at something the woman seated beside her had said. utterly unaware that anything remarkable had just taken place. To Mira, it seemed, this was simply where they belonged now, and she accepted it with the easy trust of a child. For Elena, it was not the food or even the seat itself that mattered most. It was the feeling, rare and unfamiliar, of being truly seen. For years, she had moved through rooms full of people with more, cleaning their homes, mending their linens, always careful to remain quiet, small, and unnoticed. Tonight, for reasons she still could not fully explain, a stranger with more power than anyone she had ever met had looked across a crowded room and chosen to notice her. Later in the evening, when the meal had settled and quieter conversation filled the hall, the Duke returned briefly to check on them, kneeling slightly beside Mira's chair to ask what she had enjoyed most about the feast. Mira, without hesitation, told him it was the honey bread, and the Duke laughed warmly, promising the cooks would be told to make more of it for the next gathering. Elena found the courage to speak more freely as the evening went on. She told him a little about her work, about Mira's love of stories, about the small house at the edge of town with its leaking roof that she hoped one day to repair. The Duke listened closely, asking questions not out of polite obligation, but as though her answers genuinely mattered to him. By the time the feast came to an end, and guests began to make their way back through the manor gates into the cool night air, the story of what had happened had already begun to spread. Guests who had witnessed it described it to those who had missed it, and by the time Elena and Mira walked home, hand in hand beneath a sky full of stars, the tale was already being repeated in doorways and kitchens across Ashbourne. Within days, it seemed everyone in town had heard some version of the story. The young Duke, who had given up his own seat at the head of his grand feast for a woman with no title, no wealth, and no expectation of anything at all. Some told it as a simple act of kindness. Others spoke of it as though it were the beginning of something larger, a sign of the kind of Duke Ravenscroft might become under his quiet, watchful leadership. For Elena, the story was never about titles or feasts or the eyes of a crowded hall. It was about a single moment when someone with every reason to look away instead chose to walk the length of a room and offer his own place to a stranger who had expected nothing at all. Years later, when Mira had grown and often asked her mother to tell the story again, Elena would smile and begin the same way each time. She never spoke of the food or the music or even the grandness of the hall itself. She spoke instead of a young man rising from his seat, walking toward two people the rest of the room had overlooked, and asking, with quiet sincerity, for the honor of their company. It became, in time, the kind of story parents told their children in Ashbourne, not as a lesson about dukes or feasts or grand houses, but as a quiet reminder of the kind of person worth becoming, someone who notices who has been left standing, and without hesitation, does something about it.